welcome to the webinar on CBAM and aluminium foil. Thank you very much, all those who have already logged in yet. I'm pretty sure I don't need to explain the European Aluminium Foil Association in full detail. Just a summary: we represent aluminium foil rolling companies plus the converting companies into household foil, containers, flexible packaging, and aluminium closures. Today we decided to have it under the umbrella of EAFA. And I'm very happy that Dubrink is willing to support us and to provide the practical implementation hints, advice, however you call it, because we know that CBAM is coming or has come, and it is an administrative burden, and there is a lot of complexity in the CBAM in general. I'm an economist by education, so from a theoretical point, I even appreciate instruments as CBAM because that is, making a level playing field. The issue with all those complex instruments is the practical implementation. Not everything what is great on theory should be implemented practically, we can meanwhile say, I guess, but nevertheless, we are stuck with it, and it has come to stay. So, and now I would like to hand over to Marcel to introduce Dubrink a little bit further, and to then go also into the practical implementation issues presented also by Kilian and the colleague Jan Joost. They are all now CBAM experts, probably less aluminium experts, but more CBAM experts. But that goes almost hand in hand. Just for practical information, the webinar is recorded, so it will be made available for you and other colleagues after the webinar has finished. So with this, I would like to hand over to Marcel and the entire Dubrink team to shine a bit more light onto this topic. Thank you very much, Marcel.
Yes, thank you, Guido. Thank you for the introduction. In these times, and also with CBAM, it shows that it's more and more important to have associations like EAFA, so to make sure that the voice of your community is heard. We were indeed asked to shine a light on the CBAM and to provide as much information as possible for the members of EAFA and the sub-associations, if I'm correct, to help you. So in the upcoming hour, I'm going to share as much information as possible. I will start with an intro on CBAM for those that are not yet that aware of the subject. And later I will go into calculations that might be a little bit complex. If I would go too quick because of the time, note that you can always rewatch it indeed on YouTube, which is important, but it is vital to understand how the calculation of CBAM works and what are the components you as an importer or as a supplier have to look at to try to limit the price for those that have to pay to the European Commission over the emissions that are imported. Let's see, just click. Yeah, I just give a quick introduction. My name is Marcel Duits. I'm Chief CBAM Officer at Dubrink, also President of IS CBAM, and I'm Dutch. I'm not here by myself. I'm here with Jan Joost, who was second from the left on this picture with a beautiful smile, and Kilian. We are representing Dubrink. Not everybody was on this picture. We have also Silvana, who's responsible for the Spanish market, Trish, Peter, head of consulting, and Madly, who is our one of the two CBAM success engineers. And what we do day and night is making CBAM easier for our clients. A little bit of an agenda. First, some housekeeping rules. We're going to discuss what is CBAM, the differences between EU and UK CBAM, because it's not just going to be EU CBAM, there will be UK and most likely some more in the upcoming years. The downstream expansion, which is expected to happen in 2028. How much will CBAM cost? We will especially look into aluminium, and you can inform us about which codes you would like me to look into. I'll tell you in a little bit where you can insert that, where you can find the chat module, and I will try to do a live lookup on the cost for CBAM for you. How to calculate CBAM, what will the European Commission do with the CBAM gains, CBAM as a process, because it's important to understand it's really a process, and you are one piece of the chain, but to understand the whole chain, it is vital to do CBAM in the right way. And I would like to offer you some shortcuts. Last but not least, the Q&A. So first, before we start, my Dutch English can be translated in this Google environment. You do that by going to the CC button in the bottom, and then you can turn that, for example, in subtitles in, for example, German or French, or which language you prefer. We will have some polls. We would appreciate it if you would participate, and you can find them in the area with the 9 dots. They are not there yet, but the moment when they're on screen, we will turn them on. And over here, you can ask questions. Feel free to ask questions. We will moderate them and answer them at the end of this webinar.
And Marcel, if I may quickly interject, the questions are actually not in the chat. The green is the chat.
Oh, the questions
are actually also in the Google is always evolving. Just if you want to ask a question, please also use the 9 dots and questions and answers to ask them.
That's good. Okay.
Sorry.
And if there's a question which already has been asked, you can always upvote them via the thumbs up. Small important note, part of the housekeeping, where the most important sentence is that these materials are not to be interpreted as legal, financial, or investment advice. CBAM has been a little bit accelerate, break, and sometimes reroute. A lot of changes happened in the past year. Those jumping now into CBAM don't always know that there's already quite a history, that we have been busy all together with CBAM for quite some years. From 2023, I'll show you in a little bit of a timeline in a few slides, we had to start reporting emissions. But especially in 2025, there was a big period of radio silence. A lot of companies were waiting for information how to proceed with CBAM. And unfortunately, some companies still do that, because we still do not have all the information how CBAM will look like, for example, the purchasing of certificates in 2027. Then by the end of 2025, a lot of documents leaked. A lot of information became available at once. For example, during December, a few thousand pages of legislation became available. And indeed, from the beginning of 2026, CBAM kicked off in a way that you would have to start paying from that moment. For a lot of us, CBAM really starts in 2026, but actually the reporting obligation is already from 2023. That's why some companies are like, look, I'm prepared. I've been doing this already for many, many years. And many others, for them, it's brand new, and they have a hard time doing that. And this webinar is, I hope, going to be helpful to make it a little bit easier for you. Just one step back. What is CBAM exactly? In the European Union, we have the ETS system. That means that you have to pay for a CO2 that you are emitting. There is a free allowance, which means that you have, a lot of companies had some kind of some discount that for many years you didn't have to pay, but now every year more companies have to pay over what they are emitting. And there are also, of course, a lot of factories outside of this ETS system. And what the European Union says is that if you are producing over there, that's fine, but it can't be that you heat up your factories with, let's say, tires or very dirty materials. You emit a lot of CO2 in the air, and because of that, you're very cheap. But once you import it into the EU, you will be competing with factories that actually have to stick to certain rules and have to pay over the emissions they are emitting. And they actually want that to create a level playing field. And that is what is, according to the European Union, CBAM. The problem is that this is not really the situation. it's more this, because you also have to not just look into what you get from your supplier, you also have to look into what sub-suppliers are providing those suppliers, because if those are CBAM goods, if billets are turned into, let's say, bars, and the bars are eventually imported into the European Union, then you have to calculate the whole supply chain to eventually get actual data of your emissions. And it even happens that items are entered in the EU zone, eventually exported out, modified, and entered back in again. And that makes CBAM, for many companies, unfortunately, very complex. I see the worst situations in especially iron and steel. Screws, for example, you have a lot of steps before you end up with a screw. In other sectors, for example, cement, it's easier because the amount of suppliers and is just less, and the process is less complex. Aluminium, unfortunately, is on the complex side. Now, how does the EU want us to provide data? That is via a communication template. That is this file. I think many of you have seen this one already. It is a very complicated file, and especially if you're, for example, only speaking Chinese or Turkish, it's just not easy to fill this one in English. It's hundreds of cells to click, many hours of admin, endless files exchange. It's not intuitive. Great for consultants in third countries that want to charge you a lot of hours. But there are these days, thank God, better ways how to provide this data. The second problem, and that's already what Guido mentioned, is that sometimes CBAM becomes a chaos, because if you have many suppliers and you get all that data from all those suppliers in these communication templates for many years, then how are you going to figure out in 3-4 years which exact import was connected with a certain communication template? Communication templates are sometimes renewed because, let's say, if a factory decarbonizes, it means they need a new calculation of their carbon, which is emitted during the production, and they will send you new files. At the end of this webinar, I'll show you some solutions how you can do this in a much better way. Now, what is actually included in the EU CBAM? That's aluminium, cement, electricity, fertilizers, hydrogen, and iron and steel. As you can see, most of the CN codes are in the iron and steel sector. Aluminium is second, and third is fertilizer. We as Dubring also deal for 98% of our time with iron and steel and aluminium, and a little bit fertilizers, and here and there a bit of cement. It's also reflecting in the amount of work what comes from CBAM. Now, who is impacted by CBAM? That's mostly declarants, those that are importing or that they have to report the CBAM emissions, suppliers and their sub-suppliers, who often don't always understand what CBAM is about. And we see that in Dubring that it's very important to look. In the past, a lot of companies try to really force factories to say, you need to get your emissions. That didn't really work. What we see is that once we have when we have like a meeting with suppliers of one of our clients, it's especially important to show them the financial impact, what CBAM has if you do not report accurate data. And that's what I will also do in a few minutes. I will make such calculation for you. And why does it make suppliers move into let's fix CBAM? Because they start to realize that if they do nothing, that it's becoming very difficult to sell to the EU, because their prices are going to be too expensive when you include the surcharge of CBAM. Then, of course, we have traders and intermediaries, and then there are also, of course, additional parties affected by CBAMs, like consultants, auditors, verification bodies, logistic teams, etc. It's not just EU CBAM where we're talking about. Currently, EU CBAM is active and live, but from the 1st of January 2027, there will also be CBAM UK. The difference between EU and UK CBAM is that EU is more decentralized. Every country in the EU has its own national authority managing CBAM in their countries. In the UK, it's of course just the HMRC. The preparation phase is different. In the EU, there was a transitional period where you could kind of train how to manage CBAM. In the UK, it will just start from the 2027. The timeline is different. Also, the emissions affected are different. For example, with UK, it's only direct and precursors. A precursor is a material from sub-suppliers, while the EU CBAM also takes into account electricity, indirect emissions, in case of aluminium, steel, and iron, for example. But in some other, no, it's the other way around. I'm sorry. It's included with hydrogen, cement, and fertilizers, and with the other materials, it's not part of it. And also the reporting quantity, the reporting period is different. So it's important to understand the differences between these two CBAMs, and we sometimes now get signals that also the calculation might be different. If we then turn this into a timeline, in October 2023, CBAM started. From July 2024, we were forced to only use actual data, but that didn't really work. Many factories didn't have their data ready, and many importers kept on reporting default data, even though that was officially not allowed. From the 1st of January, we started. On the 7th of April, we're going to see our first official CBAM pricing for Q1. I'll explain in a little bit why that is important, but there is a price to pay, and there's a way how to determine that price. And on the 7th of April, the price for Q1 will be available. Then we can start paying over the year 2026 from the 1st of February 2027. From that moment, you can start buying certificates. And the final deadline to pay over the emissions of 2026 is going to be the 30th September 2027. And in the meantime, on the 1st of 2027, UK CBAM hits also. Then on the 1st of January 2028, we will have a scope expansion. I will dive deeper into that in a few minutes. But CBAM is currently for a certain amount of products, but there are proposals to add in 2028 new items, like, for example, washing machines or many materials which are in your kitchen, fences, machine parts, etc. Now, I would like to ask the audience one question, and that is, how confident are you that you have CBAM under control? You can go to the 9 dots, and I think to
polls.
Polls, it is in English. I have it in Dutch here indeed. And I would like to ask, how confident are you that you have CBAM under control? I give it a few seconds. Thank you for voting. It gives me also a little bit a route how deep I have to dive in certain topics. So it's already clear that most of the people in this webinar say that they are somewhat prepared. The next is that people are not confident at all, and only a few say that they are very prepared. Congrats to those, of course. Thank you for voting. I now dive into the downstream expansion. So the proposal actually is to extend CBAM to downstream products, mostly in the steel and aluminium value chain. It's proposed to happen on the 1st of January. And if I would have to give you an overview, it's mostly industrial machines. And these are actually the codes which are currently proposed. These are more pots, pans, fences, but also whole washing machines, where, for example, aluminium, steel, and iron come together. The most interesting category is it's like products which are combining materials. So when there's, for example, a small piece of aluminium in there, and some other materials, that is actually sector 5 over here, and that is going to be a tricky one, because that makes CBAM even more complex. However, for now, we do not have to look into that. This is only 2028. Then one of the most important topics to understand in CBAM is the difference between default values and actual values. So default values are if you actually do not get verified data. That means that there's like a file provided by the EU, and you can look up what the value is, what you have to use. And these default values, we will calculate them in a bit, are unfortunately much more expensive usually than the actual values. So we see factories that, for example, ignore CBAM, they don't want to verify. Then you automatically get the punitive default values, higher CBAM cost. And for importers, it's very uncertain because they will probably face a high cost. We also see factories that are very active. They are kind of carbon conscious. They are already doing pre-verification, so they can already indicate to their importers what most likely their emissions are going to be. And because of that, and we'll see that in a bit, they can also provide indirect competitive pricing. Now, these are, for example, default values, which I just looked up. For example, on the hexagon bolt, you can see that the default value of Indonesia is, for example, very high, China too. But for example, in the United Kingdom, it's a little bit lower. Same for aluminium profiles. China is in this case high, next one is Turkey, but Brazil is, for example, very low. And if I then, for example, look into unwrought aluminium, we have the same story. So if you can't get actual data, if your supplier is not willing to verify its emissions, it is important to realize from which country are you importing. And what makes it a little bit more complex is that, let's say you have 3 factories and they all produce eventually one item. So you're importing product X, but that's made from product I, and that comes from factory Z. The moment when one company in the chain eventually provides you default values, so let's say the first one provides you actual values, the second has default values, but the third one has actual values. That means that you cannot use, at the moment, the emissions from the third factory. And usually, the more you go to the factory who really produces the material, or who smelts and melts the aluminium, that's where the highest emissions are. That's why companies are now importers now trying to look into their supply chain, like, what is exactly my supply chain and who has verified data? Suppliers, on the other hand, they don't always want to exclude that information because they don't want to provide their company trade secrets from who they actually purchase materials. And that is unfortunately a friction, what we see happening at the moment in the world of CBAM. Now, what if country data is missing? Then you have to go for default values that are based on the average emission intensity of the 10 most emission intensive countries for which data exist. But what's more interesting is that I want to ask if in the chat you could put a few of the codes you would like me to look up the default values, and feel free to give a few countries. Then in a few minutes I'll come back to this and I can give you an insight what the expected costs are going to be per ton if you would like to import from that particular country with that particular CN code. Then I now go to a little bit more difficult topic. It is how much will CBAM cost, and we have to dive into the calculation for that. And my question in the poll is to you: do you know how to calculate CBAM at the moment? I'm very curious if you are aware of that. I will activate the poll. Here we go, start. Then I would like to kindly ask you if you would mind to answer the question. Okay. It's good that we asked this question because there are a lot of people who don't know or kind of know. So I will go slow, but again, this information will be on YouTube. But it's complex, and many companies actually ask consultants to help with this. I now close this one and I move forward. Thank you very much for voting. More than half of the people do not know how to calculate. So this is the calculation for CBAM, and I will try to explain step by step how to do that. So the goal with CBAM is eventually to find out how much certificates you have to buy. because a certificate has a certain price. I'll dive into deeper, but let's say for now, every certificate is 80 euros, and per emission, you have to pay 80 euros. Well, how do you get to that amount of certificates? First of all, you have the specific embedded emissions, and that is actually the emission you get from your factory if they have their data verified. For example, dear importer, per ton that you're buying from me for the item 7608-2089, my emission is 2.5. That has been verified in the third country, let's say in China or in India or in Turkey. If they do not provide that, you have to go for default values, which are much higher. You can deduct from that a CBAM benchmark and a CBAM factor. Now, let me explain what those two are. The CBAM, let me click. Yeah, so the CBAM factor is some kind of a, they call it a phase out, but it's some kind of a discount, because the higher that number is, the more you can deduct from the specific embedded emissions. The CBAM benchmark, on the other hand, is per material what you're producing, some kind of threshold of which the EU says, look, you're producing aluminium, you're going to emit this anyway, because nobody else, of the 10 cleaners producing installations will eventually also emit this amount, and that you don't have to pay over. You only pay over what you're emitting from there on. So the CBAM benchmark times the CBAM factor, you can deduct from the specific embedded emissions. So let's say the specific embedded emissions is 2, the CBAM benchmark is 2.025, you multiply that times the CBAM benchmark, then you don't have to pay too much SEE. If your default value is very high and your CBAM benchmark is let's say 2, so let's say your specific embedded emissions is 8, and you deduct 2, then you have to pay over 6. That's very high. Unfortunately, the CBAM factor gets every year less, as you can see here, and in 2034 it will be 0. So by 2034, you will have a specific embedded emission. You deduct from that 0, and this whole green part will be irrelevant. Now, there's also this part, and currently you do not have to take that into account. But let's say if Turkey eventually will have their own CBAM system, and that's approved by the EU, then you can deduct a part of what has been already paid in that country. Most likely, the first country that will be able to offer this is going to be the UK, and currently the EU and the UK are talking exactly on this subject. Well, once you have over here calculated your emission, you multiply that times the amount of tonnage what you have. So let's say you eventually end up with an emission of 2, and you import 1,000 ton, then you have to pay over 2,000 tons your emissions. If in that case your certificates are 80 euros, you pay 160,000 euros of CBAM cost. The tricky part is that the price of your certificate is depending on the price of the ETS system. And this is a graph of last year, and as you can see, the price in 2021 was close to 30 euros. By the end of 2025, it was around 8 euros, and if I'm correct, we're now at 65 euros. And this makes CBAM a little bit difficult because, and that's what I will show in the next slide, you will only know the price of your certificate in the first year exactly by 2027. Because for 2026, every quarter, a price is determined. And that is why I mentioned in the timeline, the 7th of April, because then we will know what the price is going to be for Q1. So your emissions that you're importing, you have to eventually multiply. I'm going to actually, no. So here I have the same formula. I removed actually the part which is not important anymore, which is which is not relevant anymore. That's the blue part. And then we end up at the formula, the embedded emissions, what you get from your factory, minus the benchmarks, times the CBAM factor, times the volume that you're importing, times the EU ETS price, and that is your carbon cost. So if you are, for example, importing 8,000 tons, and you do 2,000 tons every quarter, and let's say that you have a default value because you actually don't know your actual emissions of 3.3. You do that minus the benchmark, times the CBAM factor, times the volumes, times the EU ETS price, which is corresponding with the quarter that the goods were imported. Then you end up in this situation on around 1.3 million euros. Now, if your factory is able to provide actual verified data, and you do not have to go for 3.3, but for 2.1, then as you can see, the price is going down with 67% for your importer. And that is why it's important that suppliers try to get as soon as possible their emission data in line, have it verified, and provide to importers, which is happening during 2026. In Q3, verifiers will be appointed, and ideally, in the ideal situation, in 2027, you could provide that data to your importers. In practice, a lot of factories struggle with this massively. Joost, I'm not sure if you're listening. Is there anything you would like to add to this, actually?
No, I am fully engaged. So I think this is, I think what is maybe one of the questions that may come up in the audience. Let me just turn on the camera so that they can actually see me. Yes. Some people may wonder, like, I see that there is a benchmark of 1.42 for the default values from China and 1.52 for the actual verified values. How is it possible that for the same good, we see two different benchmarks? What I think is very, very, yeah, that's the next thing. Okay. I just want to say that this is one of the data points that has to be provided. It has to be calculated by the supplier. So if you're using the defaults, then you will always use the default production method and the benchmark associated with the default production method linked to the country of origin of the goods. In case you're dealing with actual values, you can get different values here because this data is provided or is to be provided by the supplier. And I think that's what we're going to discuss next, right?
Yeah, that's true. And I see people raising some hands. We will do questions, Q&A. We have a lot of time for that, but we will do it at the end of the webinar. Yeah. Then we're going to dive quickly into the benchmarks because as you can see over here, these are the CBAM benchmark, and as Jan-Joost mentioned, they are not always the same. And I would like to show you why that is and how you actually calculate the benchmarks. This is work what we often do as consultants. But what you're looking at the moment, I'm sorry, this is not an aluminium production slide, but this is production of a steel product. And you see here three let's say the same processes, but red means that you do not have any data from a factory. Green means that you do have data from that factory or that production process. So if we go up, we're producing a hot rolled coil. We make that from crude steel, but hey, that supplier is not providing you any data, so that is automatically default values. If I take the second line, I go to the precursor of crude steel. Hey, this one actually has actual data, so that's nice. But the second one, after that, the pig iron is red, so it has only default values for you. And then the third line is from steel product to precursor 1 to precursor 2 to precursor 3, and they all can provide you actual data. I would now like to show you how it happens that if you go via the green route, that you get higher benchmark values than via the red route. And also I would like to explain you how you calculate these benchmarks, because they are a vital part of the calculation. And the more you can deduct, the lower the specific embedded emissions are that you have to pay. So you see here A and B, and this is from the legislation of the European Union. If you do not get any details, you have to take B as a benchmark value. If you do get actual values verified, you can take A. And you have to stack all those processes on top of each other to eventually get to the right benchmark calculation. I'll give you one example. The green one has actual values, so we pick A. The red one doesn't have it, so we have to take B, and then we're done. That means that the calculation to calculate these benchmarks is 0.04 plus 1.364 is 1.408. This one is still quite easy, right? A means I know the actual values. The supplier of this HRC doesn't know, and we go for B, 1.364. Now let's take the second route. Again, A, 0.044, because we know the actual values. We also know this one for crude steel. We take 0.188. But hey, this one providing pig iron is not able to provide data, so we take 1.210. Now, if I go to the calculation, there's something added, and that is the 1.05. And you might wonder, why is that? Well, as you can see over here, it says M is 1.05, and that stands for mass, meaning that somehow in this process, we are losing 5% of the material. The benchmarks are always calculated on the input of the material, not the output. So in theory, if you would take 10 tons and you do a process, and that eventually turns into 1 ton, you want to calculate the carbon, what happened with those 9 tons, maybe that has been emitted in the air, for example. And that is why the EU chooses to go for the mass before the next product is produced. And that means that you have to multiply B with the mass. Yes, Jan-Joost?
Yeah, I just maybe good to add to the understanding of the audience as well is that, people may think like, okay, but I don't produce 1 ton. We produce like a huge amount of aluminium, right? And the point is that this is for simplicity's sake, we are expressing all of the values here as 1 ton. But if you use 50 tons as input and 48 tons as output, you can still establish this ratio in the same exact way. So it is much more about total reporting quantity than about exactly like how much waste material do you have as part of a production cycle, I guess. And you can take that for a single coil, or you can do that for 500 coils on an annual basis. It's much more the mechanism that you have to understand that it applies like that.
Yeah. I usually work with 1 tons because that makes the calculation as easy as possible. So let's go now to the last one: 0.04, 0.188, 1.089. And this is the important one because this is the highest. And that makes it sometimes so difficult that, even though you sometimes have the details from your from the one who's producing the billets, or in this case, for example, from the steel factory, you can't always get there, because if the supplier in between doesn't have actual data, you can't use it. This one gets a little bit even more complex, and that is because first precursor 3 and precursor 2 come together. One of them is influenced by the mass of 1.6, so you end up in a 1.227. Then you have to multiply that amount times 1.05, because it again somehow loses its mass. And eventually we have to add the 0.188 and the 0.044. These calculations are often done by consultants, but I just wanted to explain you how this works. Then now I'm going to live actually look up some costs for aluminium. I do that in the Dubring platform. We have a forecasting tool for that. In our platform, you can track your imports, and you can connect your suppliers and calculate your CBAM cost. Let me take a look in the. There we go. I will work. I see that this one is asked. There we go. I keep it again on 1 ton. Then the countries India, China, Serbia, and Indonesia. And I see an actual value for China of 2.5. Then I can turn this one on actual value. And this is how we can compare. Well, what we see is that the actual value and the Indonesian default value are actually the cheapest. But the difference between the highest, which is China in this case, and the lowest is significant. As you can see, it's 73 euros to 35. So that's a factor of 5 in difference what you have to add to every ton that you're importing. And every year, you can imagine that the CBAM factor is getting less. Most likely, the price of a certificate is going up. So every year, it gets more expensive to import this material. I have another one there, 7613. This one. Oh, the platform asks to be more specific. There we go. This one is a bit more expensive, 93 euros. Again, China is eventually the cheapest one, then Indonesia, and if you buy currently from China versus default values, is the highest. So with China, it's clearly very important here that you get actual values, because the difference between actual and default is high. The problem with CBAM is that only from Q3 verifiers can start doing their work, because only by then it will be known who will do that job. And I think the earliest you get your verified actual data status as a factory is going to be begin 2027. Unfortunately, by then, 2026, you've already imported all your materials. And a way how to find out if your supplier is able to provide those actual data is by doing pre-verifications. But still, that's never 100% guarantee if that factory can provide your actual data or not. And it's important to take that into account, because if over everything what you're importing, you suddenly have to pay in 2027 an additional, let's say 300 euros, that's very unpleasant and painful. I see one other code, last one, 7607. There we go. Have to select one. It's this one. It's asked. There we go. Now, same story. It's almost the same emissions. It's not that interesting. We do see sometimes default values of 8, 9. So you can imagine that the cost then go to close to 700 euros per ton that you're importing. On 1,000 euros screw, 700 euros CBAM cost is 70%. While if they would decarbonize, it's 70 euros. And that's the impact of CBAM, that we believe that factories will start to look into decarbonizing, because it makes access to the EU market much, much easier. Okay. One more question. Have you gained any new insights regarding to the calculation, or is everything what we have just told was already common knowledge for you? I will start the next poll. I would very much appreciate it if this was new information for you, if everything was already old news. Well, that's good. At the moment, 20 votes are in, and 80% says that there's new information. So then I'm doing what I should do. Thank you very much for the voting. Then just quickly, people sometimes ask, like, so where does the money go to? The EU wants to have a temporary decarbonization fund, and the decarbonization fund actually wants to help companies that are exporting. It's proposed to provide targeted temporary support for energy-intensive industries facing these remaining risks, and support is conditional on decarbonization investments, ensuring emission reductions remain within the EU. If I'm correct, they are still debating this subject. So where do we, as Dubing, see the struggle? First of all, on the complexity of emission data, the scope of the required data, the free allocation people find quite hard. The fact that there are so many different CBAMs coming up, because the moment when you understand one, the second one is already coming up, and there are differences. Having someone on your side who supports you with that, who can make sure that you get the right answers, is, I think, very important, especially because for some companies there's a lot of money involved. And the pressure of verification. People want to have verified data, but the verifiers are not there yet. And companies are now importing, but you currently do not have the guarantee that you're going to get actual data instead of default data. Now, CBAM as a process, CBAM is a process. It's not just factory import. There's much more happening. You eventually have first the European Corporation for Accreditation, and they peer evaluate member states, and member states have national accreditation bodies, and they are the ones in every country, in Holland, in Germany, in France, etc., who are appointing verification bodies. The verification bodies, let's say in Bureau Veritas or in SGS or TUV, they work with their counterparts in, for example, China or India or Turkey, or name another country, who will eventually arrange that the data, what is prepared often by a consultant and the factory, is going to be checked and verified. Now, that eventually, the data from the factory eventually can go into a CBAM registry, which is by the EU created portal, which is not ready yet. I mean, they're still developing it, let's say, because that's also where you might buy CBAM certificates and some other stuff. And then eventually that data is declared by the declarant, which in the customs process with importers, they have to provide the data from CBAM. That goes to the Commission, and then the national competent authority reviews that. This sounds simple, but this is our reality. We talk a lot with procurement because you have to make decisions based on CBAM. You have a lot of imports. Some factories have, or some importers have many suppliers. They have many imports from many processes, and it's very important to make sure that you know exactly which import is coming from which production process in which factory. You have declarations what need to be done, financial guarantees, especially in cases of indirect representation, where we deal a lot with as a DoBrink, because as an indirect rep, you're taking a lot of responsibilities. In our platform, you can manage your guarantees and payments and these important variables. You need to provide an audit trail. You need to make sure that you manage your certificates. How much do I still need to buy? How much have I already bought? Knowledge retention. If employees are leaving and someone else takes over, the mess of communication templates you saw at the beginning of this webinar is very hard to hand over to others. Company centralization. If you're a large company, you're importing from several countries to several countries in the EU, you eventually want to have someone on global level that manages CBAM, but also on local level, you want to have insight on what's happening there. And then, of course, there's advisory and analytics to make proper analysis. For example, we do the same, like when you have insights, you want to know which supplier is emitting the most, which imports you have to look into, etc., etc. So that's what we do, and I think for you, it doesn't matter how you manage, but it's important to take into account that there's a lot what needs to be sorted out to do CBAM in the right way. Then Kilian, I think it's oh no, sorry, one last question, and that is I'm just curious if you handle currently CBAM manually, or if you have maybe already a way how you automate that. Let me turn on the poll. I'm a bit worried because many people were not too confident yet. Let's see. And I want to ask if you would mind to go to the poll. And there we go.
The question doesn't make all too much sense, does it?
Yeah, because it's an or.
It's an either or, and you can answer it with yes and no. But
yeah, sorry, I added this one at the end. I should not have done that. But there's more if people do it manually. Okay, thank you. Then Kilian, take it over from here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Marcel. Just briefly introduce myself. I'm Kilian Conrad. I'm from South Africa. I am a CBAM success engineer at DoBrink and also a native German speaker. So if you are reaching out to DoBrink from Austrian or German region, then you are probably speaking to me. Furthermore, I will jump straight into, from what we have heard, I think it is quite obvious from Guido and Marcel that there are a lot of burdens associated with CBAM. We have financial burden and we have the administrative burden, neither of which are to be overlooked. But that is why I'm here to present one of the solutions that are there. Obviously, there are more, but I'll be presenting DoBrink's one because it's native to us. Yeah, so we start with a worldwide network of consultants, which we really try to have a global presence. We think it is valuable to be able to speak to people in their native tongue, importers and suppliers alike. We have consultants in third countries, which help suppliers understand their role in CBAM. We monitor policy and IT-related changes. This is a big one. We want to stay up to date so we can give you fast and accurate answers which are relevant. And really, our goal is not just to make CBAM doable, but we want to make CBAM something that you can show that you have a competitive edge. Like, let's be real, those importers that will have actual values and will pay less for CBAM, they will in turn be able to reduce their product costs, which puts them ahead in the market. The way that we do this is, I'll put it very simply, very brief. An importer, they will send a data request, and on the other side, the supplier will receive this data request. They have 4 options, really. They can put in their process, and the platform will calculate the emissions themselves. They can get external data. This is through consultants on their side, and they can also send it further if there's people that they need to get from below. So if it's a trader, for example, they can send it down the supply chain. Anyone lower in the supply chain can use the platform for free, as long as the importer that is connected to these suppliers is paying for a premium. Then the last one, which we obviously want to avoid, is the usage of default values. It is possible the platform knows all the default values, but as we know, they are punitive, and therefore we want to avoid it as to the best of our ability. Then the importer will receive the data. Oh, sorry. One back, yeah. The importer will receive the data. It will be validated for obvious discrepancies within the platform. It will be calculated if they have the procedures input, and there will be an audit trail made, which is important in case future audits, they can happen for years after the import is finished. Alongside this, we have the insights, which Marcel has covered already, so we don't need to touch much on that. Yeah, once the auditing year is complete, this is when we have to report to the EU portal, and we really try to make this as simple as possible. Unfortunately, it is not possible to do it from the platform. If that becomes possible, we will be the first to do it, I promise that. But right now, we will export an XML sheet, which is directly compatible with the EU portal, which you can just drag and drop, really the easiest it could possibly be. So to sum it up, we have the 3 ways which we try and make CBAM a shortcut. It is by automation. This is really removing the administrative burden of CBAM. It is the cost modeling, the cost predictions. We can't really remove the financial burden, unfortunately, but we can minimize it, control it, and predict it to the best of our abilities. And then desktop audits, just to make sure that you're using the right data. We can't verify it, but we can see if there is any mistakes that we can catch before they reach the level.
Yeah, that's maybe interesting to add that I think it's now getting better, but 80% of the data we saw, especially last year, was incorrect. So we can't say that the factory is doing the right stuff in the factory. We have a lot of consultants. We have all around the world. We can go into factories and check things, but very often just by checking the data, which they provide, and say, look, this is our actual data, and it's going to be verified, we can see that it's actually not the right thing. And that can be from using the wrong protocol in calculation. It can be falsified documents, or it's simply that certain emissions, for example, are not possible. And then it's the case that, for example, that factory only calculated the emissions of their factory, but didn't include, for example, sub-factories, making the emissions looking way too good to compare to what actually is happening in the real situation. Yeah,
exactly. And this is something we can catch because we've been around and seen what they should look like. So
yeah, cool. Thanks, Kilian. I'll do the last one.
Yeah.
So what's next? This is like a list I created yesterday What I would do, one is I would make sure to get the basics straight. Very important, register as an authorized declarant. If you haven't done that, do it as fast as possible, because from the 31st of March, if you're not registered as a declarant, and you do not have the permission to import CBAM goods, you literally can't do that, and it will be stuck at the border. We can help you with that. We actually have done that already hundreds and hundreds of times, but unfortunately, the situation is that, for example, in Belgium, I think 1.5 months ago, only 50% of the companies that should register did register. So that's going to be an interesting situation from the 31st of March. Classify your goods correctly. They will check these things if people try to circumvent. Define internal ownership. It's important that someone takes ownership for CBAM and in larger companies, and make sure that certain procurement, sustainability, but also the CFO maybe comes together to do the right thing, and build an audit-ready file that you actually at least know and can register what you're doing. So if in a few years you're audited, that you can prove that. Then the data, make sure you control your inputs, map your suppliers, maybe set up a CBAM platform, or build something yourself if it's getting, especially in complex situations. Prepare for verification early, and ensure that the data quality is good and that you can trace back where which processes have been used for which imports. And last but not least, strategy. CBAM can be used in your advantage if you have it under control, because many companies don't. Consider hedging strategies. These EUAs, these ETS prices, these certificate prices, they fluctuate. There are ways how to streamline that. And yeah, it's not easy, but what we, for example, do as a CSE is that if we have a client and they have 40 suppliers, we invite them into an anonymous webinar, and we explain them what the benefits are of decarbonization and how it impacts the price. And those that eventually have a supply chain which is decarbonized will, especially on the long term, because we have seen the lines going up, literally be more price competitive than to those that are sourcing from, let's say, default value supply chains. And then, of course, the financial impact on the company is important. And yeah, some companies indeed are currently reassessing their whole sourcing strategy. Then I think it's time for Q&As, JJ, isn't it?
Yes.
Have you been able to monitoring them a little bit from what comes in?
Yeah, a few questions came in, and then they were pretty much answered in the rest of your presentation. So I didn't want to interject in the middle of it, but a few things did not go, are left unanswered. So let me just maybe read the question for those that can't see it. But the question is, if it is correct for our European customers, so this is a supplier asking if it is correct for the European customer to ask for verified reports from the supplier now, or is it better for us to provide one verified report for the whole year at the end? So you are not able to provide verified reports today. I had a consultancy session earlier with a customer of ours, and they received verified reports, verified emissions, and I told them, and this happens a lot, I have hundreds and hundreds of these emails because everybody always sends them to me, there is no verified emission available yet. The verification body, the company that will do the verification, is not even accredited yet. So there is absolutely no possibility that you have verified emissions. The first time you will start to see verified reports will be August, September, the earliest, so the fall of 2026. And the verification report will always cover at minimum 1 year of data. It is possible to be verified multiple times a year, I suppose, in theory, but you will pay the fees for the verification multiple times. And you also have to ask the question if that makes like substantial differences, right? Because you always have to base it on a year's worth of data. And you always use a weighted average of all raw materials you use in a particular production process. So if you don't really change those, then the question becomes like, does it actually add value to get verified more? It just seems to add a whole bunch of extra costs. That's at least my take on this. All right, and then there's another question. Does the manufacturer who sells me aluminium sorry, let me actually publish the question so that everyone can see it. Does the manufacturer who sells me aluminium need to conduct their own monitoring in order to verify the data they provide? And what exactly does that monitoring plan entail? Or is it sufficient for them to report the production method along with their energy costs? So I have actually a slide I'll quickly show. Let me see if I don't accidentally share the wrong one. Is that happening? This one? So I have, share? No, that's okay. It should overrule it. Okay. Yeah. So I have a very, very small breakdown of a production process of aluminium here. I've removed some of the bits that are not too relevant for our sector here. But if we look at foil, the third one, can you see my mouse? I reckon I can actually draw. Yeah. If we just look at this particular step, this is the verification report that you will receive from your supplier. But in order for your supplier to be able to use actual values for the raw material, the previous producer, the one who produces the plate, will also need to be verified. And the plate producer will need to rely on on-rod aluminium, who can use actual values only if the producer of the on-rod aluminium is verified. So it's either verified or it's not, and there is no in between. And the monitoring that has to be done is always relevant for the specific supplier. So this supplier, sorry that my drawing skills, that's obviously why I'm not in art school, but the producer of the foil has to have their emissions monitored because they are producing emissions there. That's what they have to do. But the precursors, the raw material, they have to do monitoring, but on their level. So everybody has their own responsibility in terms of monitoring and so forth. And I think that's quite important to understand, that it happens on every level and it always contains only your own facility. Right? And stop sharing. Okay, that's answered. Okay, so then there's the question that we produce aluminium products from primary aluminium. If the product leaves the EU, how will we be compensated? Well, this would be the temporary decarbonization fund. So one of the things that would happen is that if you pay under the EU ETS currently for carbon, and you plan to export to a country that does not have, let's say, a carbon market, then you would be able to ask for money back on the amount of money you've spent on CO2. But it is so early days for this that I don't think that we're going to see this in the next year, just because it's complicated and we need, it's an ecosystem problem because everybody kind of has to agree with it, almost like WTO rules before we will accept it. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense. Then the question was, who is responsible for setting the default values and how are they set? So it's the European Commission that's responsible for publishing them. And the actual values are based on the Joint Research Center. And also some of the data elements include data collected during the transitional period. Now that's obviously without any verification rules. So we're going to have to see if they're going to change them. I have already heard left and right that they do expect a refresh of some kind to the data. But yeah, they're managed by the European Commission ultimately. And the methodology has not really been published beyond what I just shared with you. Okay, I've understood that companies have to hold 50% of the certificates for 50% of the expected import volume on stock. Thus, it might make sense to buy certificates already now, ? So what you have to understand is that from 2027 onwards, there will be a minimum holding obligation of 50%. That means that if you import 10,000 tons of CO2, so whatever, let's say 3,000 tons of aluminium, that's 10,000 tons of CO2. If this is what you're expecting to hold, you need to have at least 5,000 tons, 50% worth of certificates in your bank account, your CBAM account, if you may. This is something that's really only going to start coming into play 2027 onwards, because there is no reporting obligation. So how can they know what to hold? It's also not possible to buy certificates today. So you can possibly buy EU allowances, but you can't actually buy CBAM certificates until February of 2027, which will be the first time that they will become available for sale. Then there's a question about financial guarantees, if you can quickly explain that. Sure. So this has to do with new companies. If you are a company that has been incorporated less than 2 years ago, or you exceed a certain risk profile could mean weak financials, so low PE to earnings ratio, high CBAM liabilities in comparison to turnover, things like this. The European Commission, or specifically the national competent authorities, have the ability to ask you for a financial guarantee. That is based on the current, the import volume for the year of the application, plus the year after. You need to make a forecast. It's part of the authorization procedure. And then depending on the sector, there's a multiplier applied. We've had some customers that had to pay close to €1 million in guarantees just in order for them to be able to import starting January 1st this year. And there are ways around that, like it is, like for example, if you can prove that the financial year, that you have 2 complete financial years, you might be able to circumvent that or avoid it rather. And there are some procedures and steps that you can take, but this is typically where the guarantee comes in. If you have a new company, this is particularly relevant, so less than 2 years old and weak financials. Those are the main things, I believe. Great. So it is said that converter emissions can be neglected when they are very small compared to precursor materials. In this case, somehow we can choose between default values from the country of the converter or default values from the country of the precursor, can't we? So beyond the emissions released at the converter, you do not have any choice in terms of what default value to choose. The default value is based, if you use default values, this is based on the origin of the material. Probably the most policed piece of legislation in world trade is rules of origin. Every customs declaration will have origin rules, and it's the origin rules that ultimately determine the origin of the material. So if you buy Turkish material, but it is sent via, sorry, the other way around, if you buy Chinese material, Chinese origin, but it is sent from Turkey, then the origin of that material is Chinese. It will be on the customs declaration as Chinese material. That means that Chinese default values apply. So this is all about the rules of origin. The master for this is customs. Like with almost everything CBAM related, customs always determines everything here. So you can't actually pick and choose. The only way you can potentially choose default values is when it is about precursor materials, like which precursor do you use, but you do have to prove the origin here. That means certificates of origin, or you claim unknown origin, but that is in 99% of the cases the least favorable scenario. So that I can't give you a better example of that. Better answers.
We have only 2 minutes to go, then we have to end the webinar. And I want to give Guido still a few minutes. The last 2 things, what I can mention from the question is like, the question is like, if there are enough verifiers. Well, it looks like that there are not going to be enough verifiers for all the factories to be verified. And there was a question about the presentation that it showed quarterly prices in 2026. Someone says, I thought the purchase of CBAM certificates can only take place in 2027. Yes, that's true, but it will be based on the prices which are set in 2026.
May I just add one small remark to that? So there's a bit of confusion around that. But again, like I said, customs determines everything for CBAM. Customs determines the origin. And the second thing that it determines is the customs clearance date. So if your goods arrive in the first week of March, then that is Q1. That means that the price of the CO2 certificates for the entirety of Q1 will apply. The first time these prices will be published for Q1 will be on April 7th. That's in about 2 weeks' time. That's when you will actually know what 1 ton of CO2 imported would cost you. And then the same will happen in next quarter, etc. When we move to 2027, then we move to the week of import. So the week will determine the price. We will have 52 or 53 prices, depends on how many weeks there are in the year, which depends on how you count. And then every week there could be a different price. Of course, it will not fluctuate as much as quarterly prices might, but it will definitely add additional complexity as well.
Okay. Guido, up to you.
I can only say thank you very much. And to summarize, everything is probably what Jan Joost just ended with. It sums up in complexity. And yes, CBAM is very complex, but I believe that you have showed that with the proper preparation and efforts, it is manageable. Yeah, so it is not something which is so frightening, which is not practical to implement without any besides all efforts, but it can be done. And I think it is super important to take it on and to dig in. And as you said, define internal responsibilities, and whoever is there from any management of the member companies on the call, provide the certain resources to your staff. Those whose management is not on the call, but have to deal with it, make your management aware that this is relevant. You cannot fade away from it, and there are ways to deal with it, and it is not impossible. I think that is the biggest takeout from this webinar, and I think it's was super valuable for the members joined, but also for others who will look at the webinar afterwards. And I would like to thank really the entire team of Dubring for this insights, the mystification of CBAM also a kind of, and and I think everybody who has further questions, the contacts will be shared of the Dubring team. There are not the only consultant, but there are one consultant on it in case you don't want to make it on your own. So thank you very much, both for all the attendees, but also those presenting, and really appreciate the cooperation so far. Thank you very much. And everybody then have a great day. Going away, CBAM is not something impossible to manage. Thank you.
Thank you, Guido, for your kind words.
Yeah.